What if one man born on a remote island to an ordinary family rose through fire and blood to command all of Europe? What if the very soldier who once obeyed orders became the man who rewrote the destiny of nations? Tell me, do you believe greatness is born or forged in war? Comment below, because the story you're about to hear might just change what you think about power, destiny, and ambition. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who loves the untold stories of history's most extraordinary figures. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The year was 1769. The Mediterranean island of Corsica, a rugged land of mountains and independence, had only just fallen under French control. Among its narrow streets and wind-swept hills stood a modest stone house in the town of Ajaccio. Inside, on August 15th, a baby cried, a boy who would one day shake the world. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not born into wealth. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a minor nobleman, educated, proud, yet always struggling with debts and divided loyalties between France and Corsican nationalism. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was only 19, yet already carried the resilience of a warrior. She would later say she sensed her son was destined for greatness even before he could walk. Corsica was no place for dreamers. The island's people lived fiercely, bound by pride and revenge. Young Napoleon grew up among tales of rebellion and freedom, admiring the Corsican hero Pasquale Paoli, who had fought against the French. As a child, he declared he would one day drive the French out and restore Corsican independence. Ironically, it was France itself that would become the anvil upon which his destiny was forged. When he was just 9, Carlo managed to secure him a scholarship to the French mainland, an act that would change everything. Leaving the island meant leaving home, his accent, his identity, and entering a world that looked down on him as a foreigner. At the military academy of Brienne, Napoleon was mocked for his Corsican origins and his broken French. The other boys called him the little barbarian. But he didn't cry. He watched. He studied. He plotted. He spent his evenings buried in books, Plutarch's Lives, Caesar's commentaries, the histories of Alexander the Great. He studied the art of war as if it was scripture. Teachers described him as serious, intense, and solitary. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was with an unsettling confidence, as if he knew something others did not. By the time he entered the Royal Military Academy of Paris in 1784, he was only 15 but already carried the bearing of a man twice his age. There he specialized in artillery, an arm of the army that demanded both precision and intellect, the mathematics of trajectory, the geometry of destruction. It all fascinated him. In his notebooks he wrote, "A soldier must think, not just fight." When his father died suddenly of stomach cancer, Napoleon, still a teenager, became the head of the family. He supported his mother and siblings on his modest lieutenant's pay, taking every assignment seriously, even when stationed in dull provincial garrisons. He had no patron, no fortune, only ambition. Then came 1789. The streets of Paris erupted in chaos. The old order was collapsing. The Bastille had fallen, and the monarchy trembled before the fury of revolution. In the provinces, young officers like Napoleon watched as the world they knew crumbled. Many fled or hesitated. Napoleon, however, saw opportunity. To him, the revolution wasn't just a political upheaval, it was a ladder. Merit would replace birthright. A man could rise by talent alone. He wrote to his brother Joseph, "Everything tells me that we are approaching great events, and that I was born to take part in them." His chance came in 1793. The port city of Toulon, one of France's most important naval bases, had rebelled against the revolutionary government and invited British forces to occupy it. The Republic was desperate. Napoleon, now a young captain, proposed a bold plan to retake the city. His superiors hesitated until a few visionary officers gave him command of the artillery. He worked tirelessly, day and night, repositioning cannons, calculating trajectories, reorganizing supply lines, and driving his exhausted men with the force of sheer will. Witnesses said his eyes seemed to burn when he spoke, his voice sharp and cold. You sleep when victory sleeps, you eat when France eats. In December 1793, under his direction, French artillery began a relentless bombardment that shattered British defenses. When the final assault came, it was brutal, smoke-filled chaos. Napoleon personally led the charge, sword drawn, his uniform blackened by gunpowder. A bayonet wound tore through his leg, but he refused to leave the field until Toulon was taken. The victory was decisive. The British withdrew. The tricolor flag flew again over the port, and the name Bonaparte echoed through Paris. At only 24, he was promoted to brigadier general. In a single stroke, a young officer from a forgotten island had risen into the spotlight of the revolution. But glory was fragile. The revolution devoured its own. Within months, the radical Jacobins, led by Robespierre, began executing anyone suspected of disloyalty. Napoleon found himself under suspicion due to his ties to Corsican moderates. For a time, he was even arrested. He spent days in a damp cell, uncertain if each dawn would be his last. Yet fate, as always, seemed to favor him. Robespierre fell from power. The guillotine turned on its master, and Napoleon walked free. He was restless, ambitious, and frustrated by inactivity. He spent his days writing political essays and even drafted a romantic novel, proof that even conquerors dream in ink before they dream in blood. He wrote, "Great ambition is the passion of great character. Those who are endowed with it may perform good or very bad acts. It all depends on the principles which direct them." By 1795, the revolution had entered another phase, the Directory, a weak, corrupt government struggling to maintain control. In October, royalist mobs rose against it, marching toward the Tuileries Palace in Paris. The city trembled. The government called for a commander to defend the Republic. Paul Barras, one of the Directory leaders, remembered the young general from Toulon. Napoleon was given the impossible order: defend the government with almost no troops. He looked out at the tens of thousands of armed rebels approaching and gave a single command that would define his career: "Bring the guns." He placed his cannons at strategic points along the streets, loaded with grape shot, small iron balls that shredded anything in their path. When the mob advanced, shouting for the king, he gave the order. The streets of Paris erupted in thunder. Men fell like wheat before a scythe. The rebellion dissolved in screams and smoke. A few hours later, silence. The Republic stood, and a new name spread across France: Napoleon Bonaparte, the savior of the revolution. At only 26, he was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior. Parisian society, which had once mocked his Corsican accent, now opened its gilded doors to him. He attended glittering salons, met influential politicians, and caught the eye of a woman who would change his life, Josephine de Beauharnais. But that, as they say, is where the next chapter of destiny begins. Paris, 1795. The city that had once echoed with the cries of liberty now murmured with intrigue and fear. The guillotine still stood in the square like a silent monument to chaos, but in the salons of the wealthy, laughter and perfume masked the stench of blood. Napoleon Bonaparte, the young general who had saved the Republic with a whiff of grape shot, was suddenly the most talked about man in France. He was small in stature, pale with sharp eyes that seemed to see through people rather than at them. He spoke with the clipped, rapid accent of Corsica and dressed with calculated simplicity, never ostentatious, always precise. But beneath that cold exterior burned an intensity that drew people in. He was ambitious, restless, and lonely. That's when he met her. Josephine de Beauharnais, born Marie-Joseph, Rose Tasha de la Pagerie, was the widow of an aristocrat executed during the Reign of Terror. She was older than Napoleon, elegant, and carried a melancholy charm that came from loss and survival. When she smiled, it was as if she understood every sorrow he had ever felt. They met through Barras, the same Directory leader who had given Napoleon his chance. Barras had tired of Josephine's affections and saw in Napoleon a convenient match, one that could bind the ambitious general closer to the political elite. But when Napoleon met her, he didn't see politics. He saw destiny. He began writing her letters, furious, passionate, desperate letters. My dearest Josephine, one began, since I left you, I live in a continual state of sadness. My happiness is to be near you. You are the soul of my life. Josephine at first was flattered but hesitant. She had seen men like him, hungry for power, consumed by ambition. But there was something different about this Corsican soldier. He didn't flatter her. He worshipped her. Against all odds, she agreed to marry him. On March 9th, 1796, under the pale glow of Parisian lamps, Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine were married in a hurried civil ceremony. 2 days later, he left for war. His honeymoon would be written not in love, but in cannon fire. France was in turmoil, surrounded by enemies. The armies of Austria and Sardinia threatened its borders, and the Italian front was in chaos. Soldiers were starving, unpaid, and leaderless. When Napoleon arrived to take command of the army of Italy, many officers mocked the appointment. A little general with big ideas, they sneered. But within days, the laughter stopped. Napoleon addressed his men with fire in his eyes. Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. The government owes you much but can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage do you honor, but brings you neither glory nor gain. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. Soldiers of Italy, will you lack courage? The army roared its answer. Then came the transformation. Napoleon moved like lightning, calculating, improvising, never predictable, against seasoned Austrian generals. He fought with a brilliance no one had seen before. He separated enemy forces, struck where least expected, and turned defeat into victory. At Montenate, he crushed the Austrians in a single day. At Lodi, he faced a bridge bristling with enemy guns and shouted to his men, "Follow your general!" Charging through smoke and bullets, he led the assault himself. When they took the bridge, the soldiers carried him on their shoulders, shouting, "Vive Bonaparte!" That moment became legend. The little corporal, as his soldiers affectionately called him, had become more than a commander. He was a symbol. In letters home, he wrote to Josephine, "You rule my heart, but glory rules my soul." Yet while he dreamt of her amid the thunder of battle, she was not always dreaming of him. Back in Paris, Josephine's charm attracted admirers, and rumors reached Napoleon's ears. His letters turned darker, tinged with jealousy. "You do not love me anymore," he wrote. "All is over. My heart is heavy. I am alone in the world." But even heartbreak could not slow his rise. In 1 year, he conquered northern Italy, defeating armies twice his size, capturing cities that had resisted for centuries, and forcing Austria to sue for peace. He marched through Milan, Venice, Verona. Everywhere the French tricolor rose, and crowds cheered his name. He didn't just fight battles. He reshaped nations. He dissolved ancient republics, redrew borders, and imposed new governments loyal to France. His victories made him not just a general, but a political force too powerful for the Directory to control. He was only 28. When he returned to France in 1797, he was hailed as a hero. Crowds flooded the streets of Paris, throwing flowers at his carriage. Artists painted him as a new Caesar. Poets compared him to Alexander. The people adored him, but the government feared him. The Directory had become weak, corrupt, and unpopular. Its leaders saw Napoleon's popularity as a threat, yet they also needed him. France's enemies were regrouping, and the nation's economy was in ruins. They decided to send him far away, to Egypt. Officially, the campaign was meant to strike at Britain's trade routes and expand French influence in the East. Unofficially, it was a way to remove Napoleon from the volatile politics of Paris. But Napoleon saw it differently. He saw destiny once again. "Europe is a molehill," he told his generals. "All great glory has come from the East." In 1798, a massive fleet set sail from Toulon, carrying 35,000 men, scientists, artists, and engineers, an army of conquest and discovery. They crossed the glittering waters of the Mediterranean and landed on the shores of Egypt, beneath the shadow of the ancient pyramids. The campaign began brilliantly. He captured Alexandria, defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids, and entered Cairo as a liberator. "Soldiers," he declared before the pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Yet destiny, like the desert, can shift without warning. Only days after his triumph, the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at Aboukir Bay. Napoleon was stranded in Egypt, his army cut off, supplies dwindling, the dream of empire fading under the relentless sun. Still, he refused to accept defeat. He reorganized, governed, and studied. He founded the Institut d'Égypte, where scholars began the work that would later uncover the Rosetta Stone, a relic that would unlock the secrets of ancient hieroglyphs. Even in failure, his presence changed history. But back in France, the situation was collapsing. The Directory was despised, the economy broken, and royalist plots spreading. Napoleon sensed his moment had come. Leaving his army in Egypt under his trusted generals, he slipped past the British blockade and sailed back to France. When he landed at Fréjus in October 1799, the crowds erupted. To them, he was not a defeated general, but a savior returning from exile. Paris was waiting, and history was holding its breath. The Republic was dying, but Napoleon Bonaparte was very much alive. The wind howled across the harbor of Fréjus as Napoleon Bonaparte stepped onto French soil once again. His ship had slipped through the British blockade under cover of night, a silent messenger from the sands of Egypt. He was thinner now, his face hardened by sun and war, but his eyes burned with the same unrelenting purpose. Around him, people fell to their knees, shouting his name. "Vive Bonaparte!" they cried, as though a ghost had returned from the dead. France was exhausted. 10 years after the revolution, the ideals of liberty and equality had decayed into chaos and corruption. The Directory, a council of 5 men, had become a symbol of everything the people despised: greed, incompetence, and weakness. The nation bled from endless wars. The treasury was empty, and royalists conspired to restore the monarchy. The people no longer believed in their leaders, but they believed in Napoleon. When he reached Paris in October 1799, he was greeted not as a general, but as a savior. The politicians of the Directory, terrified yet desperate, welcomed him with smiles that hid their fear. Napoleon, always a master of perception, bowed politely and said little. But in private, he observed everything: the trembling ministers, the divided generals, the restless mobs. France was like a dying empire waiting for someone to seize its heart. That someone was him. In secret, he met with powerful allies: his brother Lucien, the cunning politician Emmanuel Sieyès, and the ever-calculating Paul Barras. They plotted a coup d'etat, swift, surgical, and bloodless if possible. The date was set, 18 Brumaire, year the 8th of the revolutionary calendar, November 9th, 1799, by the old reckoning. At dawn, the streets of Paris were filled with soldiers loyal to Bonaparte. Under the pretense of protecting the legislature from a non-existent royalist conspiracy, he ordered the deputies of the Directory to relocate to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, outside the city. The people watched in confusion as troops surrounded the building, drums rolling through the mist. Inside, tension exploded. Deputies shouted, accusing Bonaparte of betrayal. He entered the hall himself, his uniform immaculate, his face pale but calm. "Citizens," he declared, "the Republic is in danger. I come to save it." The room erupted in chaos. Cries of "Dictator" echoed through the chamber. One deputy lunged at him. Another shouted for his arrest, and Napoleon staggered backward, nearly trampled by the mob. Soldiers burst in, muskets raised, and dragged him to safety. It was Lucien, his brother and president of the Assembly, who saved the day. Mounting his horse outside, he drew his sword and pointed to the hall. "The representatives have been threatened by assassins," he cried. "I call upon the army to restore order." The troops hesitated only a moment. Then came the shout, "Vive Bonaparte!" And the soldiers stormed the hall, clearing it with bayonets. The coup was over. The Directory was dissolved. Power, like a crown without a head, waited to be claimed. By nightfall, France had a new government, the consulate, with 3 consuls at its head. But everyone knew there was only one that mattered: Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France. In a single day, he had overthrown a government without firing a shot in anger. He was 30 years old. He moved quickly, reorganizing France with the precision of a general rearranging his army. He drafted new laws, stabilized the currency, reopened churches closed by the revolution, and created schools to train future administrators. To the people, he was the man who had brought peace and order. To his enemies, he was the end of the Republic. But France had been starving for leadership, and Napoleon, with his tireless energy and boundless ambition, filled every void. In 1800, Europe once again turned against him. In Austria, Britain, and their allies refused to recognize the new regime. The old monarchies still dreamed of crushing France. Napoleon, never one to wait for destiny, decided to strike first. He led his army through the frozen Alps, a march so perilous that even his generals doubted it could be done. The soldiers dragged their cannons over ice and rock, wrapped in tattered coats, their boots bleeding. Yet their commander rode ahead, silent, determined. When they reached the summit, Napoleon raised his spyglass and looked down at the valley below. "We are advancing," he said simply. At Marengo in northern Italy, the Austrian army awaited, strong, disciplined, and confident. The battle raged from dawn till dusk. At first the French were pushed back, their lines faltering. Napoleon watched calmly as chaos spread. Then, as the Austrians overextended, he sent in his reserves in one devastating counterattack. By sunset, the tricolor flew over the field. The victory at Marengo cemented his power. France erupted in celebration. "He has given us peace," the crowd shouted. But Napoleon knew peace was only a pause between wars. He now ruled France with near absolute authority, yet he understood that true power required more than guns. It required legitimacy. He rebuilt Paris, launched massive public works, and introduced the Code Napoleon, a civil law system that would outlast him and shape modern Europe. It was order born from chaos, reason from revolution. But beneath the facade of stability, ambition grew. The title of First Consul no longer satisfied him. France adored him, Europe feared him, and even his old rivals whispered his name with respect. He began to see himself not just as a man of his time, but as a man beyond it, a modern Caesar, destined to rebuild empire. In 1804, whispers turned into proclamations. The Senate, eager to please their master, proposed that the first consul should become Emperor of the French. Napoleon hesitated. Publicly, at least. "I accept," he finally said, "if it is the will of the people." A nationwide plebiscite followed. The result was predictable. Millions voted yes. On December 2nd, 1804, in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame, Paris prepared for a coronation unlike any before. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Foreign ambassadors filled the pews. Soldiers lined the streets. Pope Pius VII himself had traveled from Rome to bless the ceremony. As the orchestra thundered and the choir rose in celestial harmony, Napoleon entered, wearing a laurel crown reminiscent of Rome's emperors. Josephine stood beside him, draped in velvet and jewels, trembling with emotion. When the moment came, the Pope lifted the golden crown, but Napoleon stepped forward, took it from his hands, and placed it upon his own head. The world gasped. It was the gesture of a man who owed his power to no one but himself. Then he turned and crowned Josephine as Empress. The crowd erupted in cheers. The cannons of Paris thundered, and from that day forward, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer merely a soldier, nor even a consul. He was Emperor of the French. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame rang across the city. Somewhere in the crowd, an old soldier who had once fought beside him at Toulon whispered to his son, "He began with nothing, and now the world kneels before him." Yet, even as the empire was born, shadows gathered on the horizon. Across the Channel, Britain plotted revenge. In the east, old monarchies sharpened their swords. And within Napoleon's heart, the hunger for conquest burned brighter than ever. The soldier who became a king had crowned himself, but destiny was far from finished with him. The crown of France glittered beneath the torchlight of Notre Dame. But to Napoleon Bonaparte, it was never enough. He had crowned himself emperor, yet the world outside Paris remained unconquered, unbowed. The revolution had promised liberty. He promised glory, and for a time, he delivered both. In the first years of his empire, France became an unstoppable machine. Under his command, the Grande Armée, one of the most formidable forces ever assembled, marched across Europe like a storm. His marshals, once obscure soldiers, became princes, kings, and dukes. His banner flew from Madrid to Warsaw, from the Danube to the Pyrenees. Everywhere he went, Napoleon brought order where there had been chaos. He abolished feudalism, reformed laws, and opened careers to merit, not birth. To some, he was a liberator. To others, a tyrant, cloaked in the language of freedom. But to his soldiers, those who marched barefoot through snow and mud for him, he was something far greater. He was destiny itself. His enemies called him the ogre of Europe, yet they could not stop him. At Austerlitz in 1805, he faced the combined armies of Russia and Austria, two emperors against one. The morning mist cloaked the battlefield as the sun rose behind him, turning the frost to gold. Napoleon pointed to the glowing horizon and told his men, "Behold the son of Austerlitz." By nightfall, he had shattered the enemy coalition. 20,000 lay dead or wounded. The victory was so absolute that it became legend, the masterpiece of modern warfare. Europe trembled. Austria sued for peace. Prussia hesitated, then fell at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. The Prussian army, proud and disciplined, was crushed in a single day by a general who thought faster than they could move. He entered Berlin triumphant, visiting the tomb of Frederick the Great. Standing before it, Napoleon murmured, "If he were alive, we would have been friends." Then came Russia. Tsar Alexander I, young, proud, idealistic, stood against him. But at Friedland in 1807, Napoleon's cannons turned the battlefield into a furnace. Russia was forced to the table. At Tilsit, on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, the two emperors met. The image was surreal. The conqueror of Europe and the Tsar of all the Russias, shaking hands as equals. They spoke for hours, laughing, dreaming of dividing the world between them. Napoleon later said, "If Alexander were a woman, I would make him my mistress." For a brief moment, it seemed as if nothing could stop him. He returned to Paris in triumph, the master of continental Europe. He built monuments, expanded his court, and turned his brothers and generals into kings. Joseph in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. He married dynasties, redrew borders, and replaced crowns as if rearranging chess pieces. But power has its price. Josephine, the woman who had shared his rise, could not give him what he now desired most: a child, an heir to secure his empire. After years of hesitation, he divorced her in tears. "It breaks my heart," he said softly, "but my duty is stronger than my feelings." Even the emperor of the French was not immune to loneliness. In 1810, he married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, a teenage princess and daughter of his former enemy. Their union was both political and symbolic. The conqueror had joined the royal bloodline of Europe. The following year, a son was born, the King of Rome. Napoleon held the infant in his arms, his eyes glistening. "He shall inherit not the throne of France," he whispered, "but the world." Yet even as he celebrated, the seeds of his downfall were taking root. Spain, his experiment in dynastic conquest, turned into a nightmare. The Spanish people rose in fierce guerrilla warfare, slaughtering French garrisons and ambushing supply lines. Britain poured gold and troops into the peninsula, led by a sharp, unflinching general named Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. "It is a war of daggers in the dark," Napoleon said bitterly. "Even victory tastes of blood." But Spain was only a distraction compared to what awaited him in the east. Russia, resentful of French dominance and strangled by Napoleon's trade embargoes against Britain, began to defy him. The alliance formed at Tilsit crumbled like ice beneath the sun. In 1812, Napoleon made the fateful decision that would define his legacy. He would invade Russia. It was madness, yet no one dared stop him. He gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men from every corner of his empire: French, Polish, German, Italian, Dutch, they called it La Grande Armée. When it crossed the Niemen River in June, the soldiers sang and cheered, convinced that victory was inevitable. But Russia is not conquered by speed or brilliance. It is conquered by endurance and winter. The Russians refused to give battle. They retreated, burning villages, crops, and supplies as they went. The French marched deeper into the wasteland, their boots sinking into mud, their bellies empty. The summer heat turned to frost, then to snow. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, the city was deserted and burning. The flames consumed everything. He stood in the Kremlin watching the inferno engulf the ancient capital. "So this is your welcome," he muttered. Yet even he could not command the flames. Weeks passed. No peace envoy came. The winter closed in. The army began to die, not from bullets, but from cold and hunger. Horses froze where they stood. Men tore pages from their books to start fires. The temperature plunged to 30 below. "The snow burns," one soldier wrote. Napoleon tried to retreat, but it was too late. The roads were rivers of ice littered with corpses. Cossack cavalry harried the survivors. Frostbite took what bullets did not. The Grande Armée, his invincible force, was reduced to a ghostly procession of starving men. At the Berezina River, surrounded and outnumbered, Napoleon performed one last miracle. He built makeshift bridges under fire, leading what remained of his army across. When the crossing was done, he looked back at the river, choked with bodies. Out of 600,000, fewer than 50,000 survived. The emperor returned to Paris in silence, traveling alone, his uniform tattered, his face gaunt. The myth of invincibility was broken. Europe rose against him. Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Britain formed the Sixth Coalition. His enemies closed in from all sides, their armies swelling as his empire bled dry. Yet still he fought. At Dresden, at Lutzen, at Bautzen, each time he won battles that should have been impossible. But victory no longer brought salvation. In 1814, the Allies entered Paris. The French people, weary of endless war, no longer cheered his name. In the marble halls of Fontainebleau, Napoleon stood before his marshals, his companions of glory, and declared, "A soldier knows when to die, but I will not be the cause of more bloodshed." He abdicated the throne. The soldier who had conquered Europe now surrendered it. They exiled him to the island of Elba, a small speck of land off the coast of Italy. He was allowed a tiny army, a small court, and the title of emperor in name only. The world believed his story was over, but they underestimated him. Even in exile, Napoleon plotted. He read, wrote, and listened to reports from France. He knew that the restored Bourbon king, Louis XVI, was despised. The people longed for stability, for greatness, and in their hearts, many still whispered his name. In February 1815, he escaped Elba with a handful of loyal soldiers. As his ship approached the southern coast of France, a royal army was sent to arrest him. Napoleon stepped forward, unarmed, and faced them alone. "Soldiers," he shouted, "if there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I stand." There was silence. Then the cry, "Vive l'Empereur!" as they rushed to his side. In a few days, France belonged to him again. It was the most astonishing comeback in history. But it would also be his last. Paris erupted in thunderous cheers. "Vive l'Empereur!" echoed through the boulevards as Napoleon Bonaparte rode once again through the gates of the Tuileries Palace. The tricolor flag soared above the rooftops, the same flag that had once been banished by kings. People wept openly. Soldiers knelt to kiss his boots, and women threw flowers from their windows. For the second time, the soldier who became a king had returned from exile to claim his empire, but even he knew this was not a new beginning. It was a reprieve from the inevitable. The Europe he had once conquered had changed. Monarchs had learned to fear and hate him in equal measure. Across the Channel, the British watched with grim resolve. In Vienna, diplomats abandoned their wine glasses mid-toast. The man they had chained to a rock had broken free. Within weeks, a seventh coalition formed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, an entire continent united to destroy one man. Napoleon understood the odds, yet his old fire burned as fiercely as ever. "We will strike before they can unite," he told his generals. His plan was simple: divide his enemies, crush them separately, and force peace once more. He raised an army of 200,000 men, veterans, conscripts, loyalists, and for one last time, the eagles of France rose to march. He moved north into Belgium. There, fate awaited him in a small, rain-soaked field near a village named Waterloo. The morning of June 18, 1815, dawned gray and heavy with rain. The battlefield was a sea of mud, sucking at boots and wheels. Napoleon, wearing his old gray coat and the simple bicorn hat that had become his symbol, studied the ridge where the Anglo-Allied army stood under the command of the Duke of Wellington. Wellington was calm, methodical, the perfect foil to Napoleon's brilliance. He had said of his opponent, "His presence on the field makes the difference of 40,000 men." At 11:30 a.m., the thunder began, not from the sky, but from cannon. The French artillery opened fire, shaking the earth. Columns of blue-coated infantry surged forward, drums pounding like a heartbeat. At first they gained ground, capturing the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. The British lines bent, but did not break. Then from the west, the sound Napoleon dreaded most. The Prussian army under Blücher had arrived. Black-clad soldiers poured onto the field, shouting, "Vorwärts!" as they struck the French flank. Still, Napoleon refused to yield. He launched his Imperial Guard, the veterans of Austerlitz and Jena, the men who had never known defeat. "The Guard advances!" cried his generals. "Vive l'Empereur!" Through the smoke, the Guard marched uphill, bayonets glittering like silver teeth. The British waited until they were close enough to see the whites of their eyes. Then came the command, "Fire!" The hillside exploded. The Guard staggered, faltered, and fell. Someone shouted the words that echoed across Europe, "La Garde recule! The Guard is retreating!" It was over. As the sun set, Napoleon's army collapsed in chaos. Cannon, horses, banners, all abandoned. The man who had rewritten the art of war now sat silently on a fallen drum, watching his dream die in the mud. He rode back to Paris in silence. The people who had once hailed him now whispered. The Chamber of Deputies refused to support him. "The nation is weary," they said. "France has bled enough." On June 22, 1815, barely 100 days after his miraculous return, Napoleon abdicated once again. "I go," he said softly, "but my spirit will remain with the army." He sought refuge with Britain, believing he would be treated as a general, defeated in honorable battle. But the British government had other plans. They would not risk another Elba. This time they chose a place no man could escape, a lonely island in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from any shore. Its name was St. Helena. When Napoleon first saw the barren cliffs rising from the sea, he laughed bitterly. "So," he said, "this is my last battlefield." The island was small, windswept, and isolated. His residence, Longwood House, was damp, crawling with insects and surrounded by guards. Every letter he wrote was read, every visitor watched. He had been emperor of the greatest power in Europe. Now he could not take a walk without permission. But Napoleon remained Napoleon. He turned even exile into command. He reorganized his household, studied his captors, and dictated his memoirs to loyal followers. To his valet, he would pace and speak for hours about strategy, politics, philosophy, his voice alternating between fire and melancholy. History, he said, is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. He wrote of his campaigns, his reforms, his vision for Europe, a united continent, governed by merit, not birth. I wanted to build a world of reason, he murmured one night, but men preferred old chains to new ideas. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, despised him and made life miserable, cutting supplies, restricting letters, spying constantly. Napoleon called him the executioner of St. Helena. As the years passed, his health declined. The island's damp winds and poor diet weakened him. His stomach pains grew unbearable, yet even then his pride never died. One day a visitor found him standing at his window, gazing toward the horizon. "Do you think of France often, sire?" they asked. He smiled faintly. "Always. France is not a place, it is an idea, and ideas do not die." By 1821, the end was near. He dictated his final will, leaving instructions to be buried on the banks of the Seine among the French people whom I have loved so well. On May 5th, as the storm winds howled outside, Napoleon Bonaparte lay on his bed at Longwood. His last words were whispered in French. "France, the army, Josephine." The candlelight flickered. The soldier who had become a king, the king who had become a legend, was gone. He was 41 years old when he had first seized power in France, 51 when he died a prisoner. Yet in a mere 2 decades, he had changed the course of human history. 2 decades later, France demanded his body back. In 1840, a solemn procession carried his remains up the Seine to Paris. Millions gathered in silence as his coffin passed beneath the Arc de Triomphe, an arch he had ordered built for his soldiers. The air was thick with memory and myth. As they laid him to rest in the great tomb at Les Invalides, the orchestra played softly. The inscription read, "Here lies Napoleon, Emperor of the French, who died on St. Helena." But the truth is more powerful than any epitaph. He was a man who rose from obscurity, a young artillery officer from Corsica, who bent kings, popes, and empires to his will. He carried the revolution's torch farther than anyone else dared, until it burned him alive. And yet, even in defeat, his shadow lingered. His laws shaped modern Europe. His legend inspired nations, and his name, like Caesar or Alexander, became immortal. He once said, "A soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon." But the ribbon he sought was not of cloth. It was woven from destiny itself. And so the story of the soldier who became a king ends not on a throne, but in the quiet of an island, under a gray sky, far from the land he loved, a reminder that greatness, however dazzling, is always bought with loneliness. The cannons have long fallen silent, the flags long folded, yet somewhere in the echo of time, the sound of marching feet still lingers. Because men like Napoleon never truly die. They simply wait for history to remember.